Hi, I'm Emma Radigan, and this is my presentation on the educational thinker Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was a feminist philosopher and educational thinker from the late 1700s and early 1800s. Her work primarily focuses on three important philosophical points in education. Firstly, that women should be educated equally to men. Secondly, that women and men should be educated in a co-educational environment. And thirdly, some ideas for reform on the national school system in Europe in the Victorian era. I'm going to touch briefly upon each of these 3 points, talk about Mary Wollstonecraft's general impact, and then discuss a couple of critiques. So firstly, Mary Wollstonecraft is probably best known for her contributions to feminist philosophy, particularly in the field of education. Her 2 most important published works, A Vindication on the Rights of Women and Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, outline a framework in which Mary Wollstonecraft sees women as needing to have equal access to education as their male counterparts. Mary Wollstonecraft came from a time in which women were seen as rather foolish, frivolous, and silly, and most of these women were not receiving an education in some of the more traditional subjects like philosophy, science, mathematics, and the like. Mary Wollstonecraft really held firmly to the belief that to create good daughters, good wives, and good mothers, that women needed to be educated in the same manner as men. She believed that if you exposed women to the same subjects as men, such as philosophy and science, that they would make positive contributions to society, that they would make good companions for men, and that they would contribute a lot of positive elements and hold down some very important positions in society. Now, this was a really radical thought for the Victorian era, as women were not typically educated in the same manner as men. Most women were kept at home and taught very basic reading, very basic writing, and as I said, a lot of domestic skills. But Mary Wollstonecraft argued that women had just as much right and just as much need for education, and that if women were educated, society would be bettered as a whole. Secondly, Mary Wollstonecraft really advocated heavily for co-educational environments. She believed that if women and men were made to be companions, as God kind of dictates to us in the Bible, that they needed to be educated together so that they could learn from each other, they could learn about each other. And she believed that that was the best environment in which women and men could learn. Thirdly, Mary Wollstonecraft, advocated for a reform of the national school system in Europe. So at the time, a lot of Europeans were sending their children away to boarding schools where they were receiving private education, and the education system primarily had a more behavioralist mentality, meaning that they saw children as passive learners, so transmitting knowledge and transmitting knowledge of hard subjects such as science, math, art, and those children were not really interactive in their education. So Mary Wollstonecraft really believed that in order for children to truly learn, that one, they needed to be in a day school environment where they were learning both at school and at home, because it was just as important to form the moral core of a child as it was to form the knowledge and logic-based part of a child. She also believed that schooling should be free and universal for everyone, which kind of got her some credibility as somebody who was advocating for class equality in education as well. So if we were to summarize that, Mary Wollstonecraft saw the school system as needing to be universal, public, and accessible to boys, girls, rich, poor. And so those are kind of her general ideas in terms of educational philosophy, and those ideas really have had a major impact on educational thinking in general. Her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, is often seen as a foundational text for suffrage, women's suffrage, and women's rights. Also, her ideas for the call to reform are heavily influential as you see the school system begin to change and you see this advocacy for the public school system. And so some critiques of Mary Wollstonecraft come primarily from modern feminists who feel that Mary Wollstonecraft was not progressive enough in her ideas. So Mary Wollstonecraft was still really firmly founded in a faith where she believed that God gave specific gender roles to men and women. And so even though she was advocating for the education of women, she was advocating that women be educated to become better wives and better daughters and better mothers. So those traditional gender roles that we see women in. So a lot of modern feminists feel that Mary Wollstonecraft's work is just not progressive enough. It's not modern feminism and therefore is not as valuable as people make it out to be. Now, when I look at Mary Wollstonecraft's work, the primary critique I have comes back to that class equality we talked about in the education reform ideas that she had. So as much as Mary Wollstonecraft advocates for poor children to be educated in a free public education, she only advocates for that education to go so far. So for her, poor children should receive a basic education, but then they should be taught handy skills and be sent into the workforce, whereas wealthier children have the time to continue to develop their education. And so I feel like that's kind of my biggest critique of her work, is that she's really not advocating for everyone to have equal access to education, and there's still some classism there that really tends to bother me about her philosophy. But for the most part, Mary Wollstonecraft was an extremely useful and radical thinker who advocated heavily for the rights of women, particularly in education, advocating that women would have equal access, that they'd be educated alongside men, and most importantly, that the state would provide a free public education for its children. Thank you.